Hello, Agnes.
Hi, Robin.
What should we discuss?
We are going to discuss a book called The World of Yesterday by Stefan Zweig, an Austrian writer. Um, who was born around 1880 um, and died like 1942, something like that. Um, and it's a kind of autobiography, but there is, a lot of the personal material that you would expect in an autobiography is not present in this book. It's really a book about um life in Vienna around the turn of the century, and then the life of an intellectual and a cultural enthusiast, sort of traveling throughout Europe. Um uh from basically 1900 until like World War II. Uh and in Zweig was a Jew, and so he first had his books banned in Germany, and then eventually had to flee Austria and went to England, United States, eventually ended up in Brazil. And he writes this book in Brazil and then commits suicide, I think, something like the day after he submits it to his publisher. He and his wife at the age of like 60, 62, something like that. So this is a book about, it's called The World of Yesterday, and it's really, I think that's what it's about. It's about a world that he loved and that he lived in and that he sees as being gone and over.
I just read a half a dozen book reviews written on it in the last 10 years, and they all say how it helps them see themselves versus Trump today because they're
I
all,
didn't read the review by Hoffman, by Michael Hoffman.
no, I guess not.
I recommend that one. It's the nastiest review I've ever read of anything. It's like full of spite and hatred, and it's not a good review, but it's kind of such an extreme example of something that it's instructive. Anyway, it's very much uh not along those lines. So not
Okay.
the one I've read as actually as it happened, the only review
Well, I've said that a lot of historical fiction typically presents modern characters and ancient characters side by side, where the first are the heroes and the last are the villains. And that's how a lot of historical fiction goes, and I feel like this is presented roughly that way, but from somebody who lived there. That is, many people, I think, like this book because it presents someone with our views, mixed up among other people back then and how he was, relating to the other people who didn't see things our way.
one of the really striking things about this book is how extreme an example it is of a self-identified exemplar of the cultural elite sincerely and full-throatedly singing the virtues of being a member of that elite. So, and it's, I think, it's very striking the degree to which Zweig, who was, um during his apex, maybe the best known German novelist, translated into the most languages. He was an incredibly popular writer. He barely tells us about his novels, and he sort of has a little bit on his success, but the book is mostly about how he was friends with all the top artists, and kind of lists of encounters and experiences with, I was hanging out with Rilke and he said, um, and that, and also went to the best places, and, like, it's kind of showing off, except it's so sincere and straightforward, and direct. Like, there's no, kind of it's such pure showing off that I find it inoffensive, in a way that if somebody else were boasting in this way, it might be offensive, and there's something touching about somebody who was such a successful novelist being like repeatedly being like, "Yeah, but I'm a second rate compared to these people." Like, he mostly cared that he had these connections. I today looked up, he wrote biographies or sort of biographical discussions of Verlaine, Balzac, Montaigne, Magellan, Erasmus, Marie Antoinette, Freud, Fouché, Stendhal, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Roland, and Verhaeren. So he like, a lot of his output was, just these tributes to people he thought of as greater than himself. Dickens too. I love that Dickens. Um and he was an appreciator. And he was very, very happy to be able to be part of this cultural life. He didn't see himself as one of the, like, main leading lights, but just to belong to it was the joy of his life, and one gets the sense from the book that once it is over, he sees no reason to live. In the way that if you were a different kind of exiled novelist, if you were someone like Robert Musil, okay, exiled to Switzerland, um, Musil didn't kill himself, because Musil had a project. He was on a mission from God to finish The Man Without Qualities, right? Zweig does not like that. His mission was not in his novels. His mission was this cultural world that he belonged to and loved.
So, I mean, I do he writes very well and, it's very compelling and, makes you see things from his point of view and feel sympathetic toward him. I think it's like, say, a professor in college who is teaching you about great people, and then you come to respect this professor via their focus on these greater person than them. I think that's sort of a part of our high education experience, really.
It's very much like that, and it's great people, but it's also, like, the beginning where it's like Vienna was this great place. That is, it was the city that devoted itself to culture in a country that could never really prevail politically or economically. And it just decided to be the place where culture mattered. Now, obviously, this is a selection of Zweig's circle of
Right.
rich Jewish intellectuals and artists. That's the world that he traveled in from birth. He never really saw much outside of that in Vienna. Eventually, at a certain point, he travels to Russia and he goes through Galicia and he's like a bit shocked by how the Jews live over there. But so he's partly seeing obviously a particular side of Vienna, but that's what Vienna is for him.
Now, he is in the last third of the book really focused on like rise of Hitler and the change of culture because of that. And I think as a result, it makes us more think of this dichotomy before and after Hitler. But if you look at it, the world changed a lot before Hitler.
Yeah.
So we're less focused on it. You were talking as if there was the world before Hitler and after, but there's lots of different worlds before Hitler, many different stories that happen. And that's part of the interesting story he tells. But still, the central morality tale is when Hitler arrives, people like him, like, don't like him and other people do, and that's the central morality tale that drives, I think, a lot of people to like this book when they compare it to, say, Trump and how they don't like Trump. But, uh, all these different eras that he went through and how things changed then, I mean, the most striking thing for me is that this view that he had of a pan-Europe and how it should be united wasn't the view that existed when he was born. It was a view that grew and developed over his lifetime, and he just kind of thinks it's obvious. He doesn't really defend it or explain why other people might disagree or why it changed over time. It's like at the beginning, when he talks about his teenage years, he describes change, and he describes a lot of change happening in his world of his teenage years and soon after, and he's just caught up in the new part of the change and carried along. But then later, we see more change happening, and he doesn't really reflect on why, other than just thinking it's obvious that his point of view that he's acquired is the best and other people are just wrong.
I think that one way to think about it is that his book is a kind of propaganda for that point of view, and he sees his whole life as having been propaganda for that point of view. He says that in the book. That is, that the project of his life, more than, being an artist and writing novels and writing, lots of other forms of literary accomplishment, that's all been great, but the sort of political goal of all that was this kind of pan-European elite global culture, not global, European culture, right? I think he would have been happy to expand it globally if the whole world wants to be like Europe, um, which I think is, it's
Did happen.
it's a suggestion at the end that there would be the new Europe and South America or something like that. Um, but that there's like the best of humanity are these artists, and if only the world would listen to them and would let them determine everything, then everybody would be friendly to each other, and you wouldn't need He complains about how you need a passport to go into another country. He's like, "When I was young, you could just walk
Right.
to America."
Right. And that's
You know,
true.
kind of, and that's his sort of dream is that Europe would have open borders and there would be all kinds of connections being made between people as was happened in his youth. Of course, he had a very exceptional youth of wealth and privilege and connections that allowed him to travel all over Europe and have, meet a poet everywhere he went and then become friends with that poet and um but that's his sort of dream and he just thinks it's like obvious or rather on one hand I would say he thinks it's obvious that that's the world we should aspire to. But I also think uh, he wants you to become convinced of that by reading this book, and that he sees that as a project of his life, and he thinks that project failed because of Hitler. That is, Hitler, that one lone single individual. It's not the Germans, it's Hitler. Hitler individually ruined everything, ruined the project of Zweig's life. So I think it's not. His point is not. Oh well, Hitler caused change. I think you're right. Zweig thought there was lots of change going on, and some of it was good over the course of his own lifetime. For instance, sort of sexual freedom. He has a whole chapter basically on sexual openness and sexual freedom and why that's a good thing from, if he compares his youth to 20 years later or something like that. Um, but his point is that he had a project and it was this kind of pan-European cultural union and then Hitler was the enemy of that project, and Hitler won and he lost, and thus he committed suicide, would be the simplistic story.
I mean, and that story makes sense of maybe the last half, but World War One is a striking counter to his vision, and most of the artists he celebrates are embracing World War One and propagandizing for it. So that doesn't have anything to do with Hitler. There's some other problem that happens in his vision
Uh,
at the start of World War One.
it's true. No, that's right, and there's quite a lot of discussion of World War One. So one thing we should note is I was quite suspicious of his treatment of his World War One. Basically, he presents himself as having, from the beginning, opposed the war, World War One. And, from the very first moment, I was like, "Wow, I didn't know there were any Germans in that position because the people were very enthusiastic about World War One when it started. And I asked ChatGPT, and it basically said that's the big distortion of this autobiography. And it could well, we could be charitable to Zweig. He could just sort of he has to write this book without any notes, right? And so he's thinking back, you know, in like 1941, he's trying to remember back to 1914 and, he might not remember that at the beginning he kinda went along with it like everyone else did, and then he slowly, but maybe a little more quickly than some other people, came around to the thought that this war was a mistake. Um, but he almost presents World War One as though it were like the ghost of World War Two coming in advanced. It's like, um, it's the it revealed that there was a crack in the European facade, and that was the crack that Hitler was then going to exploit.
But what is that crack? I mean, later he just wants to blame it all on Hitler, but clearly Hitler isn't the cause of the crack if he exploits it.
Right. So one discussion that he has at the very end is like maybe Freud is right and there's just something inherently brutal about human beings. Human beings love brutality. They are just not civilized. That is, I have this ideal of civilized life. Europe could be a standard for the whole world. And in particular, the civilized, cultured, artistic elite would be the standard for everybody else. And then we could all just like be artists and it would be amazing. But maybe that's not what people want. People want brutality. They want killing, violence, etc. And and that's just deep in human nature. And so we're never gonna have good things.
So he often describes these deep, fulfilling conversations that he has with people in Paris and everywhere else. That's much of his life he describes. And he describes all these people as insightful and humane, etc. And then I'm always like lacking. He never says what they talked about or what sort of insights they got from any of these conversations. He just seems to get great, you know, satisfaction from these conversations. But I go like, if you don't remember what you talked about and what you got out of it, how do we so know what value you got?
The counterexample is Freud. He actually does tell us what he got out of the Freud conversation. The thing
That's That's near the very end of the book.
Right, but it actually doesn't it stand to reason that he's reporting all these conversations, many of which happened many, many decades earlier. The one where he's able to give us the insight is the one that happened maybe just 3 years earlier rather than 20
Right.
earlier. So, but you're right. I mean, you're right, especially he goes on and on about Verhaeren and, Romain Rolland and all these poets that he hangs out with, and, "Oh, we had this wonderful afternoon together, we had these wonderful conversations," and and I feel really jealous and like, wow, this is not my life at all. I don't I don't go around and just have these amazing conversations with all the top intellectuals of my world. That's like my dream. That's what I would like to do, but it doesn't really happen. And even when I meet these people, we just don't have great conversations. That's not actually what happens when
Right. I mean,
yeah.
I would think if you the way to have great conversations would be to risk bad ones. And so there should be a percentage of difficult, bad conversations that he would have had by trying to talk about important things. He talks about a wide range of personalities of these people, and some of them are very self-centered, etc. And so you might think he would report that sometimes the conversation went badly and he had trouble and that, this guy didn't like him anymore. And, but everybody likes him and everybody's friends with everybody, it seems.
Yeah. It is amazing the degree to which he represents sort of everybody is liking him. We know in fact that like he was scorned by a lot of the top German novelists. So people like Thomas Mann and Musil. Musil reportedly refused to go to South America because Zweig was there. The whole continent
Right.
was a no-go if Zweig was in it. But I think the people who hate so lots of people did hate him. But I think they hated him not personally. They hated him because he was a second rate. They thought he was a second rate talent who was very, very successful. And so it's a little bit like how people hated Zola. Like if he wasn't as high class an artist as someone
Well,
like
do they hate third and fourth class people even more, or do second class people get the peak hate from the first class people?
I think that maybe second class people who are very successful. I mean, I think someone like Thomas Mann, it would be like, um, it'd be like, you know how you kind of hate the people who you fear like yourself? Like this.
Yeah.
I might have worried, am I really a first rate? Am I like Musil? You know, am I the level of Musil? It's like, no, you're not Thomas Mann. And so, but he's way more popular, right? And then Stefan Zweig is like one level down. And so that might be the best environment for hatred is if there's somebody who a little bit exaggerates the vices that you are worried that you have.
So I thought the best evidence he gave for his own humility was the fact that he said that he tried to write some stuff of himself and got some, recognition for that. And then he backed off and decided, no, I need to learn from other people. And he spent like another decade just trying to read other people and write biographies and summaries of them. And then later on, after that, maybe to write on his own. So that is a interesting respect for tradition of the form of, this professor we might imagine who's focused on other people greater than themselves. He takes a while before he writes for himself.
I think throughout this, he's really focused on people and than himself. That is, I think there's a certain kind of humility that comes across. There's both a kind of humility and a really a kind of deep like cheerfulness and love that is like like the responses, you know, where someone like Mun or Musil being like, that's a second rate talent, like the bitterness of that. There's nothing of that in Zweig himself. He thinks he's a second rate talent. He thinks he's
Yeah.
not as great as some of these other people. And he's like, "Isn't it wonderful that I get to meet them and that they exist?" He's just happy that these higher people will even, like, talk to him. So it's very I find it very charming. Uh, and, um, and it makes you trust him because it makes you trust him as a guide through this world. Like, you're being, you know, someone who had great access, uh, and doesn't think that he's the best part of it.
So after World War II, for the last 75 years, I think many artists want to present their role in the world as not just an appreciation of art
Yeah.
and a, enjoyment of a good life, but as being on the right side of history and pushing for the right sort of things. And he's kind of doing that here in the sense of once we get to Hitler, he is against Hitler and on the right side there, although relatively minor in terms of his actions, but he's taking a position. But he's not very much in his life up until that asking how can he influence the world outside of art. He is focused on the world of art, and that's enough for him. That's the valuable world he wants to focus on and pay attention to. And he doesn't feel much need to justify himself in terms of an effect outside of art.
Right. Um, um, I think he is interested in saying that he was ahead of the curve with Hitler.
On his opinions, but then what did he do exactly?
Right. I think he's also very interested in presenting himself as apolitical. That's very important to him.
Then why does it matter if he was on the right side of history in terms of his opinions if he didn't do anything with the opinions?
Yeah, that's a good point. Um,
Why should we admire so much that he saw Hitler was bad? If I mean, if he was warning people about Hitler and like doing things to help like get people out of, for example, he basically says he didn't really try to get people out of Germany. He was just so despondent that nobody would listen that he just like left.
it's true. Like he didn't use his advantage to help people, it seems. Like unlike many people were heroes and, helped get people out and
Right.
Guy just like got himself out. Um,
At the last moment.
right. Um, uh, and but not so much at the last moment that not at the very last moment that he
Right.
was, he visited Austria in like November or something like that, and then it was March when uh uh, it was, invaded, right? And so there was some time there. Um, and he talks about that final visit in November where he tried to convince people and they were just like, "Right, oh, fine."
But
Um,
that is a more of a world of yesterday from our point of view. In our world, artists more want to justify themselves in terms of larger political impact.
right. I mean, I think part of it is that um, I almost feel like his politics is being apolitical. That is, he has this idea of a world that elevates artists where, um, the artists, what they care about is art, and part of what it is to care about art is not to care about politics very much. Um,
Right. So his world of yesterday is the world, say, between 1880 and 1940, not the world from before then or the world afterwards. It's a particular transitionary world.
right, and he highlights the fact that his generation, unlike previous generations, didn't respect their parents. That is, there was this break, and that's the very striking. The beginning of the book, I think, is the most striking, where he just talks about like what it was like for him to be a teenager and someone in their 20s around 1900, and that there was this world where for sort of as far as one could see backward, there was this veneration of age, and people would try to look older, and no one could achieve any status until they were a certain age, and that his generation was sort of the generation that celebrated youth and that broke with their parents and that were going to form like a new way, um and um that's his sort of origin story is, coming of age in that time that was beginning to celebrate youth in a new way.
So the reason I read the book and recommended it to you was that we've been reading things about the transition to the modern era and what caused that. And this does seem to be an early description of the change to the modern. And it helped me to maybe hypothesize that a key element was youth movements, because that's what he describes is a very, he was involved in youth movement and he was describing the youth movement as influential and causal in terms of make changing culture. And then over the rest of his life, he doesn't seem to see youth movements very often as important. I mean, he describes the Hitler Youth,
Yeah,
and then he describes after World War One lots of youth artists and how they were making big changes in art. But those are all somewhat, in his mind, somewhat separate from the world he's describing, the trajectory he's describing. Youth movements mattered to him in his youth. And later on, it doesn't seem like youth movements matter so much. But I have to suspect that, in fact, youth movements continue to drive this world change, and he's not very aware of how the new youth generations are influencing him and his world of art. he seems to think that these older people he's around that are very famous are the center people of the world of art. When he's older, that's what he thinks. But when he's young, he thinks it's the youth who are having this strong effect on the world of art.
Right. I mean, I think that he respects the older figures as well, even in his youth. But there is this just super powerful peer effect that he experiences, and that maybe is something new. The fact that people like we never find out anything about his family except at the very end where he like visits his mother before she dies. And then when she actually dies, he doesn't go back because it's already been Nazi Austria's already been taken over by Nazis. Uh i- and that's basically the only thing we learn about his mother is that he doesn't go back to he's dying. Um we just don't know much about we don't find out if he had siblings. I don't know if he had siblings or
I mean,
um,
so that's there's two ways in which his world of art is separate from other things. One, we just talked about politics. It's a world of art that's separated from politics, but also just family. Yeah, he describes
yeah.
all his deep experiences with other artists, and he doesn't even mention when he gets married or
Yeah.
divorced or
Very
is
famously,
visiting his brothers or anything like
um,
that.
his second marriage was interrupted by the declaration of war, and that's why we find out that he was getting married a second time. Um,
Right.
War, like, it was a way to talk about the war. But yes, he sort of doesn't think his own life is that, interesting or,
Who doesn't think it matters with respect to art. That is, he just sees this separate world of art that's separate from family life. And he talks about going to an area where he lives and visiting, meeting people, but he doesn't meet family. That doesn't seem to matter to him. Or does he write letters to family? Does he think about family? He doesn't talk about dating. He doesn't talk about anybody else but artistic associates. Does he not have any other associates? I mean, we know he must have some, but like he doesn't want to present that.
right. Right. So it's not just a culture that crosses national boundaries. It's also a culture that's in some way deracinated from one's family that he's sort of promoting. It's this literary culture. Um uh
And it's denationalized. That is, he's not very interested in culture that's anchored in its original place.
right, right. Nationalism is the big evil. Like even though he wants to sort of explain how he loves Austria without being a nationalist. Um uh And in fact, I'm just remembering now that I saw a photo of him. He has a brother who never shows up. I don't know what happened to him, but I saw a photo of him where he is sitting and his brother is standing, or one or the other. So he had a brother. Um, uh, but we never found out anything about his brother or what happened to the brother after World War II, during World War II.
Right.
Um,
So this world he's celebrating is remarkably unanchored. That is not connected to the world before he was born. It was a whole, deviation from it. And now it's arising out of youth cultures across Europe, I guess. So it's not anchored to any particular place in Europe. And it's not connected to politics or personal life. So what is it connected to? Where does it come from? Why is it valuable? He just sees it as its own thing.
mm,
I mean, he doesn't even say, and people enjoyed their lives because of this, or my many readers wrote to me about how much I meant to them and how beautiful. He doesn't even talk about the non-artists, the consumers of art, and their relation to the art. It's all about the artists themselves.
there's a very vivid and moving description of the Viennese opera productions that are put on after World War One, when the city is like in shambles and nobody has any money, and like a loaf of bread could cost like 20,000, whatever the unit of I don't know what
Right.
currency is. Um one day and then like 5 the next day or whatever. During that time that they would go to the opera and it was like there was no heating and they were all huddled together and they were all wearing these like threadbare clothing. but that, like, there was never such a, like, beautiful such an attentive and appreciative audience because they thought this might be our last opera performance that we ever get to see. Um, so there are things like that, about, like, appreciation, and he's very much an appreciator of personalities. So he gives these very vivid descriptions of faces and of bearing and of, what it was like to talk to Maxim Gorky or right? Like what the persona, the sort of, um yeah, like, uh, uh what the human individual of the artist is like. You find out that a lot about the people, for Heron, those people, they're major characters.
There was this TV show a while back called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous,
Mhm.
where they would just walk you to famous people and see their world. And this book feels a bit like that. That is, we are sort of just enjoying hanging with celebrities, basically,
Yes, lifestyles of the,
artistic and creative or something.
artistic cultural elite, where it's important to Zweig to point out that these people aren't wealthy, or they're not necessarily wealthy. Most of them aren't wealthy. Zweig is wealthy. I mean, not at all times, because, um, but, he just talks about these artists in France who eat eat in the same way as, like, the not peasants, but the mechanic or something who lives downstairs from them, and they have this simple life, but they're, like, living for art, and so it's this beautiful life, and they are, they have these communities and they all love each other. And like, this was another, I asked ChatGPT to tell me more of what's unrealistic about this book. And the other was like, that it doesn't reference the kind of, nasty, vicious, backbiting, world of like, the Parisian cultural elite, which you see in like some of Zola's novels that like, someone like Zola and, um, like different artists would become enemies to each other, and they weren't like just like in living in friendly harmony. But still, that's yes, that's what he wants to present us with is an lifestyles of people who are artistically rich, and his own wealth. The thing that makes him proud in terms of having wealth is that he's able to buy a lot of, um like signatures and like autograph and like manuscript pages of,
So
great.
I read this history of Christianity a few months ago, or maybe sometime in the last year. And Christianity went through this era of relics, which is kind of strange when you look back on it. And people were really obsessed with relics. And now this guy's obsessed with relics here.
He's very obsessed with relics, so he wants, like, an original Mozart score, or he's very proud of having Mozart's own catalog of Mozart's music.
Right.
Um, a Blake drawing, like, we have a list in the book of all these things that he was able to collect, and he's very, very proud of this collection. He's kinda maybe a way to think about Zweig is, like, he's, like, the ultimate fanboy. He was just this fan of Kubrick,
Right.
and, he wants to share his fandom with the reader.
And this fandom functions partly as a religion for him in the sense of it's just the ultimate value. It doesn't need to be justified in terms of other things. And he just really worships even the relics associated, physical relics associated with it. And, basically, I'm just struck by how little he ever seems to need to justify this world in any other terms than its own.
Mm.
Um, that is, he doesn't tell us why it was good all these people were doing art and why anybody else cared and anybody else benefited. It was just clearly in his mind the thing that was valuable, the sacred, really. And he was just happy to be associated with it anyway and to share it with the rest of us. And he's trying to put the best possible light on it. And then he's going to say that it's threatened and destroyed by these, you know, profane people in World War I and then later Hitler. Um, although, I mean, in a sense, Hitler and World War I people didn't dislike his art. So there's something of a disconnect. Well, how is it exactly that Hitler is so anti his world? That is, yes, war gets in the way of this world, but it's not.
Hitler, banned all his books and made them be burned.
But because he was a Jew, not
Yeah.
because of the art. That is, the world of art in general, Hitler was fine with.
Well, I mean, no, there were a lot of restrictions. Like
Sure, but it was,
you know,
it was not prioritizing his
Drusu,
world.
who's not a Jew, was also had his, uh,
Right.
and so. That is, I think that Hitler's not known as, like, a literary appreciator. He is somewhat known as a musical appreciator,
Right.
uh, but, he, was, um I mean, I think if there was Zweig suggests that he was one of the harder people to ban because he was so popular that Germans really liked him and they read him and, they like, it was hard to say, "We're not gonna let, him be read." Um, but I do think he felt attacked, and
But I think it was more just that he thought the world of art was just so sacred above it all, and he did see it as above it all in his own life, and then he was mostly offended by somebody like Hitler saying, "You're great, you're good, but you're not the highest priority. We have these other higher priorities than we, sometimes
I
we
think
make
it's
you."
true. So I think in some way, like, let's say you went to Zweig and you were like, "Yeah, but what if I don't care about Beethoven or Goethe?" He would just be like, I guess you're just not part of the club. Like, I guess you just this book is not for you. That is, if you don't recognize what the greatest achievements of human civilization are, if you're blind, like, he would feel sorry for you. He'd be like, "Well, you also have disability where you're unable to appreciate what the best things are. I'm not gonna be able to, like, give you sight if you're blind."
So in talking about World War One propaganda, he more explicitly says that at the beginning of World War One, most national elites, government elites, respected cultural elites greatly, and they wanted cultural elites to be saying positive things about them, and they were going to go out of their way to solicit cultural elites' endorsement. And later on,
Right,
with
so they had write a poem about the war that was, like, the biggest thing ever, but then when everybody turned against the war, they turned against that guy. Cautionary tale, like, don't let yourself get politicized because politics switches quickly.
right, but I think he says that in World War II, the government elites were just less eager to get cultural endorsements.
That's not quite true. Remember the thing about Strauss? So, I think that, it's so the thing was that the cultural elites were not gonna endorse Hitler because he was not a cultural elite. That is, he came from nothing. He didn't have a university education. This was, like, unheard of that somebody could attain significance in politics from such a lowly, disrespectable beginning, and the cultural elites were just they couldn't he says this, that they couldn't imagine taking such a person seriously, but Strauss was a counterexample. He was at the very top musically and very, very well respected, and he was sort of willing to play ball with Hitler, even early on. What Zweig says, and I think that this is I asked someone about this who knows more than I do and substantiated this is roughly accurate, that Zweig that sorry, that Strauss sort of could see the writing on the wall and thought he was gonna get more cooperativeness from this regime if he too was he hated it as well. He also looked down on Hitler. He saw him as a second, someone who couldn't make it as an artist, the worst thing you could be. But was willing to like pretend for the sake of in what he wanted indulgence for his grandchildren who were Jewish and uh, also for his artworks. So I think that the Nazis very much did want cultural legitimacy. It was just hard for them to get, but when they could get it, like with someone like Strauss, it mattered a lot to them.
But they were more able to do without it. I think the description at the beginning of World War One is that the elites just thought they really needed these cultural endorsements and that that
Mhm.
was really important. So there was a mutual respect of the top of. He definitely talks about how before World War One, pretty much everybody, I guess, including him, just presumed that government elites were just competent, and whatever they said was probably a reasonable thing. So there was mutual respect between government elites and cultural elites. And that broke down through World War One and then into World War Two. And by the end of World War Two, I guess the story is that there's just no longer a mutual respect so much between the cultural elites and the government elites. And that was part of the world that was lost, the world of yesterday,
Yeah.
which is striking that it's a revolutionary world compared to the world. He talks about this very stable world of authority before he was a child, right? But now this new world is very creative, et cetera, but it still contains some of the elements of that old world, including this mutual respect of the elites. And,
Right.
after World War II, we have much more hostility and conflict between different kinds of elites.
Right. So you might think of it as there's something closer to a unified elite beforehand. And then like, the world we live in now, right, is very much a world with multiple elites, each of whom sees itself as oppressed by the remaining elite that it is not a part of, right? So there's
Right.
university professors like us, there's the tech elite, there's just the, um,
Hollywood elites.
like Hollywood elite, government elite, right? There's all these elites and they kinda hate each other, and they don't trust each other, and, Zweig basically gives us a picture of a world in which this was not the case, that the, actors, theater actors were revered by politicians, and, like, it was all one big love
Right.
fest, according to him.
Well, except there was a time component. That is, the world he grew up when they were rejecting older elites in favor of newer ones. So there was this element of fashion, but maybe at any one time, all the new fashion people respected each other across different categories, even if they weren't respecting the older elites quite so much. Or maybe they respected them, but just, decided their time was over or past. But there's a bit of a conflict with this idea of a world where all the elites respect each other and everybody knows their place, and the idea that everything was changing rapidly and they were rejecting a lot of old stuff, and that the young people were getting much more status than previously had been able to get.
Right. I mean, I find his picture like, I find myself being jealous of his life when I'm reading it, and thinking, like, "This sounds really amazing um, to have this kind of social life where anytime you go somewhere, you have these, like, deep friendships with, the most creative, interesting people in all over the world, um, that you are able to activate, um, uh, it like, not the war part, but and the exile part, but just the kind of cultural peaks of his life seem very attractive to me. Do they not seem that way to you?
Well, they just seem less accessible. That is, he describes his early life as he early on gained fame and very high endorsement, and then he could go travel and use that to get access to the most prestigious people. So, if you didn't have that fame like he has, you're not going to be able to go to these, walk into a city and meet yeah, and wealth. Yes,
Yeah, yeah. Um, right. I mean, sure. Like you also would need to live at his time period, which we don't. I mean, there's many net
right.
conditions that we don't meet. Um, but um,
Well, my jealousy would be, what was in these conversations? Would I
yeah,
actually have gained insight from them? What would I have learned? What would we have talked about that I could have developed and learned from?
I um, I agree that there's something frustrating about the fact that he kind of presents you with all these people and these supposed great conversations, and you're like, um, uh, what actually like why don't you share it with us? You feel left out. Um, um, there's one anecdote that I want to tell because I was very struck by it. It was a French, I can't remember the name, but it was during his time it was during the Paris section. Maybe I'll find it as I'm talking to you. Um, and um, uh, uh, there was a guy who he's very close with. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, he's a big fan of Walt Whitman and reminds him of his name is Léon Bazalgette. That was his greatest friend among the French, and he, I think lived with him and went to his house, whatever. And um, but Bazalgette, Zweig writes, disliked everything I was writing at the time very much. He liked me personally, and felt respect and gratitude for my devotion to the work of Verhaeren, this other poet that Zweig was into. He was always came to Paris to welcome him. He helped him whenever he could. They were like better than brothers. Okay, we don't find out anything about Zweig's actual brother, but this is his brother. But he just unsparingly told um, Zweig that he was just a bad writer, and um, and they remained friends. They remained close through this. That's a kind of ideal of friendship, I think. The ability to be
Yes.
close friends with somebody who, like, to the point where Zweig tells that this guy would often be editing some volume and looking for contributors and asked Zweig for help. And it was understood that Zweig should not volunteer himself because the guy didn't want to publish anything he wrote, right?
Right.
But he would help him find other people. So that's the sort of thing where I'm like, wow, that is kind of an ideal of intellectual friendship that we don't see. Where else do we see that kind of thing articulated?
It does make me wonder to what extent Zweig, in his interactions with these people, took a lower role. That is, he might have just praised them and then talked about how great they were and just
Yeah.
took on a subservient role to them in his interactions with them, which allowed him to meet so many of them and get along with them so well, because he would just always be praising them and not really asking him much about his own opinions or his own writing or, pushing his own conversation topics. Maybe the reason everybody got along with him so great was because he was just very accommodating.
Right. I mean, maybe it's very clear that his appreciation for all these people is quite sincere. And if it was clear to them too, I think it's quite enjoyable to be in the presence of somebody who very sincerely appreciates the
Indeed.
artistic talents and contributions.
But then what would they have talked about?
Yeah.
I mean, I almost feel like he's gonna say, "I love that book of yours where you did this thing, and why did you make this character this way?" And they would explain something about it, and th
Right, it's true that the one conversation that we do get a report of, which is Freud, he's basically like, "Well, that's how I learned that Freud is right and I was wrong, and here's Freud's theory about how the innate human barbarism will always surface in some way, and, I was naive and I had this approach that civilization could triumph, but Freud taught me that it couldn't." So it's like it's the report of a conversation where you could get that same material just by reading Freud. You wouldn't have had to
right.
talk to Freud. Um,
And maybe that's where many of those conversations were.
right, and I guess I think that now that I'm thinking about it, even that conversation, the point of telling us about it was to get us to appreciate Freud. That is, there's very elaborate descriptions of Freud's face because he had this cancer of the jaw, I think, and how he became thinner, but how he forced himself to work through the pain and to talk through the pain. It became painful for him to talk, but he would insist that he would keep talking and he wouldn't take morphine even though except to the point where it became clear to him that he couldn't work anymore, and only then did he allow the doctors to give him morphine. And, like, this story about how Freud was right about the brutalism is really part of the presentation of Freud, and that what Zweig was an appreciator of was people, like, not the works. The works were just a
Right.
way to appreciate the people. That's why he's so excited to get these,
Well, he
and
spent a lot of time writing biographies, so we might look at the biographies and say, what was emphasized in those biographies? Maybe it was the person, the
I mean,
personality.
even just the fact that he wrote biographies, right? He's
Right.
like critical essays on the works. He wrote like discussions of the people. So that's already a sign. I haven't read any of his
A
biographies.
and you might think if you are an artist and a famous writer of biographies comes around wanting to talk to you, you might think, "Well, maybe they'll write about me."
But and he did. I mean, so a number of these people, Verhaeren, Roland, Freud, um, were people that he knew and then wrote about. So that was a real thing he did. So yeah, you might think he's gonna write about you.
So, I think at some points he suggests that he knew these people before they got famous.
Yes.
So we might wonder, well, to what extent is he showing good taste in knowing who will become famous later? Or is it just a generational thing? He was along with a cohort that was rising and he was part of the cohort.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to have the impression that it's just like Vienna around 1900 was, the height of all human civilization and just it was just filled with geniuses, and so you could basically not walk down the street without tripping over a genius, and so he became connected to all these amazing people.
But not just in Vienna, when he went elsewhere, this is also
He would go to France and he would also trip over geniuses, and Italy, and he would also it's true. But maybe once you connected to enough geniuses in Vienna, then you can use your circles.
I
Um,
mean, it could be that he met a lot more people than he's telling us about, and he selected the ones who became more famous.
sure, that's true, right? He's not gonna, he only has so many pages, and he's right. He's gonna tell us about the ones uh, that from the point of view of 1942 are still noteworthy. Um, um, so yeah, I mean, I think that he is pretty interested in showing off his good taste, and his predictability. Like more than he's interested in showing off his own literary skill. That he could see who else to appreciate. Or that he um could take the temperature of the times. Those are the things he's really proud of.
So we could focus on this person and his style and characteristics, or we could focus on the time, and the book is pointing us to the time.
Yeah.
And then I think, the most interesting question then is, how is that time different from the time before and after? And is there some pattern there of a trajectory across time, whereby the world first changed in one way and then it changed in another? So the first thing that happens, we might say, is suddenly artistic stuff starts changing more rapidly, and younger people can rise in status faster because of new artistic fashions. But that art is separate from politics in an important way, at least among the artists, even though there's a lot of political fashion happening and a lot of new young people in politics also rising in status. So he sees these worlds as more separate, but they have mutual respect.
Yeah.
That the high, they will give respect for the high status people in the other status hierarchies, but they just don't care much about the other ones. They're sort of separate worlds.
Right, and the mutual respect, I think, is part of, why all these artists were willing to jump on the World War I bandwagon. Like, Zweig makes it pretty clear, like, nobody really knew why they were fighting World War I. Like, this guy was assassinated who everyone hated,
Right.
and it went by in the news after a few days, everyone thought it was gonna be nothing. But it was like, well, I guess if the politicians have decided this, it must be really important. And so that there was this kind of mutual faith that they were then willing to back the war effort. And then at some point, I guess it's a result, and I think it is interesting that it seems like it's a result of these experiences that artists become opposed to politics and they become suspicious, and then you get this very antithetical um uh relationship of Hitler to the artists, right? Eventually.
Right. So I think of it as a slow decline in coherence of culture.
Mm.
So, before he was born, the world is slow changing in a very coherent world where all the different kind of elites are integrated together and have mutual respect. And many kinds of culture are just fit together. Even, furniture and landscaping and architecture and art and all sorts of things. There's just this coherent world. And now all this thing starts changing more rapidly. And that creates like incoherence over time, and that things don't match over time and that stuff is changing, but still there's this presumption that it all kind of fits together somehow, and that's the mutual respect among the different kinds of elites. And then that breaks down after the end of World War II. That is, there's just less coherence in the sense of different kinds of elites respecting or presuming to fit well with the other kinds. And so culture has just become less coherent over time in several different ways.
Right. Right. And I guess specifically not coherent in the sense of an adversarial relationship. And but then also that like the result of that is that artists feel like they have to be political. They have to take up politics as their profession, where their art is that's part of what their art is doing. And maybe part of what Zweig's book is helpful for is sort of a view on what it was like to be an artist before you had to be political.
Or before you thought that was your role. So I think
Yeah, that's what I mean.
in many ways today, artists are proud of their political role. Often they see themselves as thought leaders and sort of helping to set emotional tones for the larger political world. And they see themselves as the advance guard of cultural changes.
Right.
And they are substantially in many ways,
Right. And but like
but
right.
in opposition to other kinds of authorities.
Right. So if you think about just the number, yeah, maybe it's just a very maybe it's a feature of our world that we don't reflect upon or notice that much, that there are all these elites competing to be the real elites. Um and now, I mean, eh, intra-elite competition has been a thing for,
Sure.
certainly since like at the ancient world, and it's like the big theme of um a lot of like
Right.
political philosophy. So, but I guess the point is that
You in the past you would compete within your realm, but the realms would sort of have a petite
yeah,
detente with each other.
right. So like Weber, Weber's idea was very much that like science was one vocation, politics is another vocation, and or even Kant, what is enlightenment? It's like, well, in your capacity as whatever it is that you do, you shouldn't be political or say your mind, but then you can put on a different hat or something. Whereas now it's like there's just one hat that everyone wants to put on. Um, so yeah, that's um, maybe a really striking feature of our world.
But you but earlier on, I think we're seeing this movement. That is, he's not just an artist, he's part of this pan-European movement. That is, he's part of a cultural movement, and it's trying to make a pan-European art, but it's, I think, not just art he wants to be pan-European. He wants people's identity to be largely pan-European.
Yeah, it's
And
a little confusing, like what that means, because you might think it means something um, like the euro or something,
right.
But like it's very clear that he respects and wants to preserve cultural differences. I read somewhere today that like, he insisted that French always be spoken at lunch. This was when he was living in England. Okay, so he's German, he's living in England, he has his German niece or something over.
Right.
They always had to speak French at lunch. And it was she says she thinks it was partly to shut the kids up.
I see.
But, like, he had this it was very important to him, like, to learn all these different languages and to use these languages, and he tells us that he presents, in Italian when he's in Italy and in French with
Right.
France, and it's not that he thought somehow, like, they should all be homogenized, right?
Right. So he's not very clear on what differences are okay and what differences are not okay in this pan-European concept. I guess he doesn't want war differences, I guess, is one difference he doesn't want. But
Right.
what other differences are okay?
But he likes the fact that that you can characterize, like, what Russians are like, what Italians are like, and that they're different, and, like, the
Right.
determinants of them.
But they all have a fondness for each other's differences as opposed to a hostility for their differences. But you might think differences would cause hostility.
Right. He wants this world where there are sharp cultural differences between, like, French people and Italians and Germans, but that there's a kind of fondness or appreciation for those differences.
I mean, it's also sort of echoing a modern travel ideal. That is, the traveler likes to go to places that are different
Mm.
because that makes travel so much more fun. And he is a traveler to some degree, but to what extent does he want do they benefit by being different as opposed to the traveler enjoying the differences?
Right. Right. He is very much a kind of appreciator or spectator of cultures. Um,
Right, but in World War I is where these differences, you know,
yeah.
led it to hostility for the difference, suspicion for due to the differences, and then he somehow thinks that's not at all appropriate, but it's the same differences you might think that could lead to hostility and suspicion as well as charming entertainment.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I guess that's sort of what he means by his ideal is having the differences lead one way, not the other. Okay, we have
We should.
soon, but we should say something. I feel like this has been a very indulgent episode and that we've just like talked about this book that we both just read. And some of most of our listeners will not have read this book, and so maybe say something about why someone should or shouldn't read it.
I read it in order to understand the nature of the modern. And the first part of the book, you can stop there if you don't want to read the whole thing, describes this youth movement in, roughly 1900 Vienna. And I think it's a great description of a youth movement from long ago and what it's like to be in that world with young people not only feeling tied to each other and that they had, autonomy and they had momentum and that having influence on the world. And then what happens when those people grow up to have influence on the world? That I think is because people go back to the '60s youth movement or something as if youth movement started then sometimes, but of course they were much older than that.
Okay. So I will say that I recommend this book to people who are um a certain kind of activist. There is some of my best friends are part of an activism movement that doesn't have a name, but it's like a humanities activism, great books activism. And I think that Zweig was in some sense, the like unsung leader of that movement. That is, this is a book, people are constantly feeling like the value of the humanities is somehow not appreciated and people don't understand how great it is. And like Zweig is somebody who is singing the praises of that kind of humanistic learning. And the great men who wrote great books, they're pretty much all men. Um, uh, and that I think those people should read this book. Maybe they'll find it's a little bit of a mirror, and maybe they'll think it's a positive mirror, maybe they think it's a negative mirror, but you don't get a stronger version of that view anywhere else, I think, than here.
And it's a modern version. I mean, I'm sure in the year 1500 to 1600, there are lovers of the arts who would celebrate the arts and humanities, but they would be different from today's activists. And Zweig is more like today's activists in a world of rapid change of culture, still
Right.
celebrating the humanities.
Right.
All right, I guess that's enough for tonight.
Okay.